Get away from here! You and that filthy boy both!
Duke sees orphan boy crying and follows him, only to find the widow. He never stopped loving. Get away from here. You and that filthy boy both. Now. The landlord's voice cracked across the morning air like a whip, drawing curtains aside in every window along the lane. Eloise felt the worn traveling bag strike her shoulder before she could raise her arm to block it. Then the shove, hard, deliberate, and she was on the packed earth of the road, one hand flying out to catch herself, the other finding Maddie by instinct, her fingers closing around the collar of his shirt before he could stumble. The door came next, swung with the particular force of a man who wanted the sound of it to carry down the street, and it did. Curtains shifted in the windows across the lane. A woman with a basket paused at the corner and looked, and then looked away, which was worse. Eloise straightened. She picked up the traveling bag from where it had landed in the mud. She did not look back at the door. She had made a study over the years of not looking back at doors. Maddie stood beside her on the packed earth of the road, his small hands loose at his sides, his blue eyes wide and absolutely dry. He'd learned not to cry in front of strangers. He'd learned it at 5 years old in the back room of a charity house, before Eloise had found him and taken him home, and the learning had settled into him the way early lessons do, quietly and permanently. He looked up at her now with an expression that asked nothing and offered everything, the way only children who have survived too much can look at the people they have decided to trust completely. She took his hand and they began to walk. The fog lay thick over the country road beyond the edge of town, turning the hedgerows into gray shapes and swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The traveling bag was not heavy. There was very little in it. That was its own particular cruelty. 3 weeks ago, she had still had the small brooch her mother left her, the one piece of her old life she had managed to keep across 9 years of diminishing circumstances. The landlord had taken it against the debt. She had let him, because the alternative was Maddie sleeping in the open, and there was no calculation in which a piece of metal weighed more than a child. She did not allow herself to feel afraid. Fear was another luxury. She held Maddie's hand more firmly and kept walking. If this story is already pulling at something in you, stay with it. It is only just beginning. The fog shifted, somewhere behind them, and then beside them, and then ahead, the sound of hooves on packed earth. Slow, measured, the sound of horses being reined in deliberately rather than stopping by accident. Eloise moved to the side of the road, pulling Maddie with her, her eyes lowered in the way she had perfected over years of being a woman alone, in places where being noticed was rarely to her advantage. The carriage came to a full stop. She heard the door open, heard boots on the step, then on the road, footsteps, unhurried even, carrying the particular weight of a man who has never needed to hurry because the world has always waited for him. She kept her eyes down. A long pause. Then, from somewhere slightly ahead of her, she heard a man's voice, deep, with a quality of careful restraint, the voice of someone who chooses every word before releasing it, speak a single sentence addressed not to her, but to the small boy standing at her side. "Why are you crying?" Maddie did not answer with words. He turned and pointed. His small arm extended toward Eloise, and the man's eyes followed it, and Eloise found herself unable to move. Not because her legs had failed her, because Julian Witstone, Duke of Witstone, was looking at her across 40 feet of fog-wrapped country road, and the expression on his face was doing something she had not planned for and could not immediately classify. He stood up slowly. He walked toward her. The fog parted around him and closed behind him and did absolutely nothing to soften what was happening. She raised her chin. She had nothing else left to raise. He stopped 3 feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the horses shifting in their traces and the faint drip of moisture from the hedgerow and Maddie's careful, controlled breathing beside her hip. Then Julian said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled and not entirely steady. "Mrs. Breyer, you will come to Witstone Hall." It was not a question. She knew better than to treat it like one. The carriage interior smelled of leather and cedar and something she could not name that her memory reached for anyway, reflexively, before she stopped it. She sat across from Julian with Maddie pressed against her side, and her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes directed at the window, where the fog was thinning as they moved inland, and the shapes of trees were beginning to resolve out of the gray. Julian sat opposite with his long legs angled slightly to avoid her space and his eyes on her face with an attention he was not troubling to conceal. He asked her name. She told him Breyer. She watched it land. He did not yet connect it, but she saw him not connecting it, saw the slight pressure at the corner of his mouth that meant a thought had arrived and been set aside for later, and she understood that she was borrowing time, not escaping anything. Witstone Hall emerged from the mist as they turned through the gate, its dark stone rising against the colorless sky, the clock tower marking the half-hour with a sound she felt in her sternum. She had looked at this house from a distance 9 years ago, during the brief and disastrous season when hope had seemed possible. She had never been inside. She had imagined it in the years since with the particular vivid accuracy of someone who has nothing better to do with their grief. It was exactly as she had imagined. That seemed unjust. Mr. Thatcher met them at the door, a tall, spare man of 60 with eyes that took inventory of the world very quietly and recorded everything they found. He looked at Eloise for one fraction of a second longer than was strictly professional, and something moved in his expression. Not surprise, but the specific discomfort of a man who recognizes a wrong he once failed to prevent and has not yet found a way to forgive himself for it. Then it was gone, and he was all efficient courtesy, directing a housemaid toward the east wing and instructing the kitchen on tea and broth and dry clothes. Maddie said thank you to the Duke before anyone prompted him to. It came out clear and direct, the way Maddie said everything, without the ornamental gratitude that adults performed and children usually mimicked. Julian looked at the boy for a moment as though the words had arrived from an unexpected direction. Then he nodded, once, with a gravity that treated the boy's thanks as the serious thing it was. Eloise noticed this. She noticed it the way you notice something you were specifically trying not to look at. The room they gave her was in the east wing, sage green wallpaper and a fireplace that was already lit, and through the connecting door, a smaller room for Maddie with a window seat and bookshelves and a narrow bed with a quilt that was clearly old and clearly good. She stood in the doorway between the rooms after the housemaid left and looked at Maddie sitting on the window seat with his hands in his lap, looking out at the estate grounds with an expression she had never seen on him before. She recognized it after a moment. It was the look of a child trying very hard not to want something too badly. She understood it completely, because she had been wearing a version of that same expression for 9 years. That night, alone by her fire, she allowed herself to feel what she had been holding at a distance all day with both hands. She was inside his house. She was breathing his air. On the other side of a wall, somewhere in this ancient, beautiful, impossible building, Julian Witstone was either sleeping or not sleeping, and she had no way of knowing which, and it was not her business. And she had to leave as soon as it was safe to do so, and every single one of those facts was true, and none of them were helping. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Every country, every city, every small town at midnight. We read every single one, and we want to know where this story is reaching tonight. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality, like the pause between a question and its answer. Maddie inhabited Witstone Hall with the thoroughness of a child who has always known exactly where he belongs. He followed Mr. Thatcher through the back corridors with the focused attention of someone conducting a serious investigation. He interrogated the cook at considerable length about the hierarchy of the copper pots. And on the third morning he appeared at Julian's study door, knocked twice with great precision, and when Julian said come in, stepped inside and asked him directly whether the portrait on the far wall was his father or his grandfather, because the jawline was the same, but the expression was entirely different. Julian looked at the boy for a long moment. His grandfather, he said, and then, because Maddie's eyes had moved to the bookshelves with the frank curiosity of someone who intended to be thorough, Julian found himself saying, "You can look at anything you like in here." Maddie looked at him with those clear blue eyes, assessing, trusting, direct in the way that only children who have never been given reason to perform can be direct, and said, "Thank you, I will," and began a careful and systematic tour of the room. Julian watched him. He did not speak, but something in his face shifted, slowly, carefully, the way heavy things shift, into the very early beginnings of something he had not felt in a long time and had not expected to feel again. Eloise was watching from the corridor through the half-open door. She turned and walked away before it could take any further hold, because she recognized what she was feeling, and she did not yet trust it, and she had learned the hard way that the things you want most are also the things that can be taken from you most completely. Lady Lavinia Coldwell came on a Tuesday. She arrived in a carriage that was slightly newer and slightly more expensive than strictly necessary, and wore a dress the color of winter sky, and smiled at everyone in the hall with the warm, assured smile of a woman who has never doubted her welcome anywhere. She was gracious to Julian in the practiced, familiar way of someone who has spent years making familiarity feel like inevitability. She was charming to Maddie in the slightly elevated way adults are charming to children when the child is not the point. And she looked at Eloise. She did not stare. She barely glanced. But in that brief, passing assessment, pleasant on the surface and absolutely still beneath it, the way deep water is still over cold and lightless places, Eloise felt herself measured, categorized, and filed as a problem she had already solved once and was entirely prepared to solve again. Lady Lavinia said how lovely in a tone that meant nothing of the kind, and moved on, and did not look at Eloise again for the remainder of the visit. That was, in some ways, more frightening than open hostility. When she left, Julian asked Eloise if she was well. Eloise said yes. It was the most expensive lie she had told in years. That evening, Mr. Thatcher stood at the window of the entrance hall and watched Lady Lavinia's carriage disappear down the drive. His expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific fear for a very long time and has just been reminded, with perfect precision, why he has never been able to put it down. That night, unable to sleep, Eloise walked the east corridor in the dark and found Julian already there. He had been unable to sleep too. The candlelight did what the fog could not. It removed the comfortable distance between people and made pretense feel very thin and very temporary. He told her she reminded him of someone. She said it was a coincidence. He said he had stopped believing in coincidences. She asked him what he believed in instead, because she was tired and her guard was lower than it should have been, and the question escaped before she could retrieve it. He was quiet for a moment, not performing thought but actually thinking, the way a man does when he wants the honest version of something rather than the polished one. Then he said that he supposed he had come to believe that the things we lose do not always stay lost, that sometimes they come back to us changed, and we come back changed, and the question is whether we are brave enough, the second time, to reach for them anyway. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the candle, but she felt the words settle in her chest with the weight of sentences that were not entirely about what they appeared to be about, and she said good night, and walked back to her room, and did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days later, he found the discrepancy in the records. He came to her in the library, the old household ledger open in his hands, and he laid it on the table without preamble, and pointed to the dismissal complaint filed 9 years ago in a neat, precise hand that belonged to no staff member he had ever employed. He did not frame it or approach it carefully. He simply put it in front of her and asked her to tell him the truth, all of it, from the beginning. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "You want the truth?" she said. "Here is the truth. I wrote to you 3 times. 3 letters, each one more restrained than the last, because I was trying very hard not to humiliate myself further than I already had been. Not one of them was answered. I spent 6 months telling myself there had been a misunderstanding. Then I stopped telling myself that because it was kinder to accept the loss than to keep reopening it." Julian said nothing. She continued. She told him about the brooch appearing in her traveling bag the morning after Lady Lavinia's visit to the neighboring house where Eloise was employed. She told him about the dismissal and the witnesses who had been positioned, though she had not understood it at the time, to see exactly what Lady Lavinia needed them to see. She told him about the marriage to Mr. Briar, which was decent and sufficient, and never once reached the part of her that needed reaching, because that part had made its decision and was not revisable. She told him about Maddie, found at 5 years old in a charity house with those clear eyes and that terrible, careful stillness, and how she had known within 5 minutes that she was not leaving without him, because she understood in her bones what it meant to be a child that nobody came for. When she finished, Julian sat very still. His hands on the table were shaking slightly. He said her name. Not Mrs. Briar. Her name. The one he had known before everything was taken. She looked at the window. "I am not telling you this so that you can feel better about what happened," she said quietly. "I am telling you because I am tired of carrying it alone. That is all. Do not mistake one for the other." The silence that followed was long and honest and more painful than argument would have been. "I know," he said finally. "I know the difference. And I am not asking you to make it easier for me. I am asking you to let me try to make it right. Those are not the same request." She did not answer, but she did not leave either. And in the economy of a woman who had learned to give nothing away unnecessarily, that was considerable. He summoned Lady Lavinia on a Friday morning. She arrived composed, as she always arrived, and sat across the desk from Julian and heard him present the evidence with the quiet authority of a man reading from a final and irrevocable ledger. The handwriting analysis, confirmed by 2 independent experts. Mr. Thatcher's written testimony, including the specific evening he had watched something being placed in the governess's room and said nothing, and had lived with that silence for 9 years. The timeline of Lady Lavinia's visits, set against the timeline of every critical event in Eloise's destruction, which could no longer be attributed to coincidence by any honest reading. Lady Lavinia tried several things: polite confusion, thoughtful concern, a careful suggestion that elderly servants' memories were not always reliable, and then, finally, the quieter move, the implication, delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head, that a public restoration would damage Eloise's remaining social standing far more than it would damage Lady Lavinia's. Julian looked at her without speaking for a long moment. Then he told her, in the quiet and complete voice of a man who has made a decision that is not open to revision, that Eloise Briar's name would be restored in every record that mattered, that his solicitors had already been instructed, and that Lady Lavinia was not to enter this house or address this household again. He told her that every county family whose drawing rooms had been used as stages for her campaign would receive a letter detailing the facts, and that if she wished to contest any element of those facts, she was welcome to do so before a magistrate. Lady Lavinia stood. She held her head very high. She walked out of the study and down the corridor and through the front door without another word, and Mr. Thatcher closed it behind her with a click that was very quiet, and in its quietness, the most final sound Eloise had heard in years. Eloise stood at the study window and watched the carriage move down the drive and disappear through the gate. She waited until it was completely gone. Then she exhaled. A long, slow breath she felt she had been holding for 9 years, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. Justice, when it finally arrives after a long absence, does not require commentary. It only requires witnessing. If you felt that moment the way we felt writing it, that quiet, long overdue exhale, hit the like button right now. This story exists because of people like you who stay until justice arrives. The letters went out the following week. Maddie was formally adopted before the solicitors on a Thursday, given the name Witstone, given every right and protection the name carried, given, for the first time in his life, a future that could not be removed from him on a morning's notice. He sat in Julian's study to receive the news with his back straight and his hands in his lap, and his expression very serious, meeting the weight of the moment the way he met everything, directly and without flinching. When it was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, in a voice that was working carefully to stay level, whether he could still call Eloise what he had always called her. Julian said yes. Eloise, standing at the window so that neither of them would see her face, said yes. Maddie nodded once. Then he looked at Julian with those clear blue eyes and said, simply and without ceremony, "Thank you for coming back for her. She never said so, but she missed you, even when she was pretending she did not." Julian looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to deserve coming back." Maddie considered this with the gravity of someone who takes apologies seriously and does not accept them lightly. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and asked if he could be excused to tell the cook, because the cook had been worried. If this moment hit you the way it hit us, please like this video right now. It tells us these stories are worth telling, and we have many more ready for you. That evening, when Maddie was asleep and the house was still and the fire in the library had burned down to a low, steady warmth, Julian found Eloise there. He did not position himself for effect or prepare what he was going to say. He simply stood across the room from her and asked, in the plain voice of a man who has learned at considerable cost not to assume anything, whether she would stay. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, as the person this house had been waiting for. Eloise did not answer immediately. She looked at him across the firelit room, and she let herself do what she had been refusing to do for 9 years, which was to think about what she actually wanted, rather than what she could afford to want. She thought about the roads and the fog and the doors that slammed. She thought about the traveling bag that was never heavy enough, because she had never been allowed to accumulate enough to fill it. She thought about a boy upstairs sleeping in a room that was finally and permanently his. And then she said the thing she had been afraid to say for so long, that the fear had begun to feel like a personality. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "I am not the same person I was 9 years ago. I do not forgive easily, and I do not forget at all. And if you are asking me to stay because you feel guilty, then my answer is no. I have survived guilt's charity before, and I will not do it again." He did not flinch. He did not rush to reassure her. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he knows the person speaking deserves to be heard all the way to the end. She continued, "But if you are asking me to stay because you want to know who I am now, not who I was, not the version of me that was convenient to lose, then that is a different question. And I might have a different answer to that one." He said very quietly that it was the second question he was asking, that it had only ever been the second question, that he had spent 9 years trying to remember exactly who she was and failing, because the truth was, he had never known her well enough, and he understood now that the not knowing had been its own kind of failure, and he did not intend to fail in the same way twice. The fire settled in the grate. The house was very still. She said yes. It was the first yes she had ever said that felt like arriving rather than leaving. And somewhere above them, in the east wing, in a narrow bed with a good quilt, a boy with blue eyes slept without dreaming of roads or fog or mornings with nowhere left to go. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who needs to believe that love delayed is not always love destroyed, and that some happy endings simply take the long way home. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And if you are new here, welcome. You arrived at exactly the right time, because next time, we are telling the story of a woman who spent 20 years believing the man she loved had chosen someone else, only to discover, on the night of his wedding, that the letter she never sent had arrived after all. That one will break you before it puts you back together. You will not want to miss it. We will see you there.